Hi there. Thanks so much for coming to watch this talk entitled Dynamic and Different Real-Time Look Development for Stylized Projects. I'm Nick Carver. I've been working in video games for about 20 or so years. In that time, I've been a character artist, an environment artist, a concept artist, and done art direction. And more recently, I've started moving into doing more and more of this kind of real-time development, look development within engines, whether that's Unity or Unreal. There's 3 examples up on the screen of different aesthetics created in Unity in real time. And really what I want to talk about today is using traditional art principles to guide the process of identifying and achieving a wide variety of stylized looks, because stylized is a word that gets thrown around a lot in video games, but quite often it's very specifically limited to certain aesthetics. Like for a long time, the stylized aesthetic was what we saw in Overwatch or Fortnite, a kind of stylized PBR type look, or you might say a low poly faceted indie look is quote unquote the stylized look. But really, you can do anything in real time. And I find it particularly interesting to, as I say, use traditional media, paintings, illustrations, whatever, as the sort of inspiration, the fuel for then working out how to recreate those aesthetics in real time. So this is just a quick little montage of different projects that I've done in Unity, just exploring different aesthetics in real time. You can see I'm a big fan of Ligne Claire, Mobius, and Tintin and things like that. That's definitely like a heavy weighting towards line work in a lot of these experiments. So yeah, here's the contents that I'm going to get through, hopefully in the next 45 minutes. So I'll talk very briefly about my career background up till this point, and then a little bit about the objectives of the talk. Hopefully there's information here for both people on more on the art side of things and also on like the tech art or programming side of things. I'd definitely say I'm more of an artist than a technical person, but I found that moving around in different areas of the art department over the last 20 years has given me insight into how, the more sort of technical production aspects of game development work, and that experience has sort of given me the ability to play around with lots of different resources to try and find these different looks. But yeah, hopefully there's stuff for everybody that is useful. I'll do a quick overview on the positives of doing this kind of in-engine stylized look development versus, doing it more as like 2D concept art. I think, obviously 2D concept art is still super useful in all situations as well, but I'm finding more and more, coming from like more of a 2D background, but now doing more work in real time in 3D, I'm finding that the flexibility of being able to change things on the fly, to reuse assets, to kind of mix and match and find new combinations is super interesting and a flexible and quick way to work. So if you're from more of a 2D background, but you're curious about doing more work in engine or in a 3D application, hopefully this will give you some inspiration for that as well. So I'm going to then talk about a specific project that I developed in detail to speak more generally about some of these principles behind working in different stylized aesthetics in real time. And then talk a little bit about, stylization, and then using, as I said before, using traditional art principles to guide the process of actually finding a real-time look. And then, a short section on post-processing, and then questions. Here are some of the companies that I've either worked at or for in a freelance capacity. I was at Free Radical Design in the sort of early mid-2000s. I don't know if anybody's ever played Time Splitters, any of those games in them. Couple of nods there, that's good. So yeah, that was my introduction to games, was working on, am I loud enough? You guys hear me okay? Yeah. No? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So 5 years at Free Radical, working on Time Splitters and some other games that I'm less proud to put on my CV. And then I did about 7 years at Blizzard. I went there to work on the Titan MMO, which was, what eventually became Overwatch after a lot of pain and, backward steps. And then since then, I've moved. So I went over to the US for that period, and then moved back to the UK after that, and worked remotely for Riot Games for a few years. And then since that point, been mainly freelancing. Career highlights so far, definitely the racing cat from Time Splitters 3. I did that in 2005, and it's been downhill ever since, but it was good while it lasted. Here's some examples of a few projects that I've worked on in recent years. Arcane was a super fun project to be involved with. I did work on a number of the seasonal updates, chapter updates for Fortnite, and then more recently Hyperlight Breaker, which I think is out soon, later this year, TBD. So in addition to the stuff that I've done kind of professionally, the last 8 or 9 years, I've really gotten into sort of indie development, doing my own attempts at learning how to make games solo. My favorite thing to do is come up with what I think might be interesting mechanics, see if I can actually, as a non-programmer, see if I can actually get those things working. I mean, I tend to work with visual scripting systems, whether that's Bolt or Playmaker or Blueprints in Unreal. So I'll mess around, try and get something working from a gameplay perspective, and then if I can get it working, think about what world, what aesthetic would suit this particular combination of mechanics. So here's 3 older examples, and here's 2 that are a little more recent. The one on the left is probably the thing that's closest to being called a game that I've created. I think I have a demo that's about an hour's worth of gameplay, and the idea with that is that it's kind of like a small, almost like diorama that runs on a 60-second loop, and you as the player can pause it and rewind it and fast forward it. And there's a whole load of puzzles and mini games in there, so manipulating time, you can achieve all these little objectives. It's pretty fun. I may release it someday, but I may also get distracted by some other idea that seems even more interesting, which is often what happens. In addition to that, because of the prototyping work that I've been doing for my own projects, I got the opportunity to develop a number of gameplay prototype ideas for this company called Coherence, who are a cloud-based multiplayer company, which was super fun. Unfortunately, I was working with them in the infancy of their technology, so I didn't actually get to implement much multiplayer within my project, but they paid me to make my own ideas for 6 months, so thank you to them. So let's talk a little bit about the objectives, the takeaways from this, hopefully. So as I was saying before, for people who are more on the art side of things, I hope to encourage you to, if you haven't already, start using game engines more as a way of exploring your ideas. Rather than thinking of it as a place you go to maybe do finished work as a production artist, as a concept artist, maybe you can get in there and once you have a fairly basic understanding of how the different components work in terms of geometry and shaders and material, post-processing, lighting, those sorts of things, you can really, that combined with knowing what resources to look at and look for and use within your projects, you can kind of take your ideas in whichever visual direction you want. And for people who are more on the technical programming side of things, I would say, I would encourage maybe to think about, if you can, think about traditional artistic principles during the creation of tools or shaders or things like that. Sometimes I think it's easy to get bogged down purely in the technical and the technological, whereas, the more that technology advances, we still look back on these key artistic principles. They don't become less relevant or less true. And thinking about things artistically can sometimes free you from being sort of very linear in your sort of technologically driven thinking. So I'm going to talk really quickly about what I think are the main benefits of working this way in terms of using real-time tools in Engine to create different looks quickly. So in terms of its benefits, I would say it's super flexible. So you can use custom shaders and post-processing filters to achieve wide-ranging looks. So for people who aren't familiar with post-processing, it's kind of everything that happens after the initial render. So you can change that sort of initial image in any number of different ways based on adding filters on top of it. As we'll see in a minute, I'll show some examples. I think it's really quick, particularly as you develop more and more resources that you can reuse, whether that's models or materials, textures, shaders, different combinations of post-processing filters. You can build up this library, and then when you have like a new job or a new idea where you want to explore some different aesthetic that you've never looked at before, if you already have this kind of toolkit of things you can pull from, it gets really, really fast to then pivot what you have and hit some new aesthetic. And what you see is what you get. I think as good as 2D concept art can be in terms of selling the vision for a project, if you've created that thing in real time and you can kind of put a camera in there and move it around, I think you immediately get a truer indication of how that will feel in game, and also whether it's suitable for the game that you're making. Like, you might have an idea like, I want to use this specific aesthetic for this game, but then when you actually create something in real time and you fly around in it, you might realize that, oh no, this actually doesn't suit this genre of game, or maybe, oh no, this is too noisy, and then you have to kind of go back to the drawing board. But if you're doing it in real time as early as possible in the process, then maybe you don't have to do so much of that unnecessary work in 2D. So here we have a very boring looking corridor. What I tend to do with a lot of this work is, rather than building everything from scratch, if I can go on the Unity Asset Store or the Marketplace for Unreal or Sketchfab or wherever and just find something, like even when I'm doing commercial work for clients, they will often give me maybe a blue sky piece of concept art, but it tends to be early in the development process. So rather than sitting there and modeling out all of the things that are required for their particular IP, what I'm really trying to do is find that real-time vision. And so if it's like a medieval fantasy thing, and I can just, for the purposes of this specific exercise, go on an asset store and just grab something that's similar, then I can either just use that as a way to explore whatever it is they're after, or I can adapt it to get closer to their particular IP or aesthetic. So yeah, so super boring school corridor, but with the magic of post-processing and shaders, we can take it in a number of different directions pretty quickly by changing the lighting, changing the rendering, adding different post-processing effects, doing some small amount of work on the textures. But like the same scene that we saw before, we can obviously do different lighting and rendering treatments, or we can go in some weird pixelated, trippy direction. But again, like the base asset that I used is the same throughout. Again, you guys, if you've been on the asset store or on the Unreal Marketplace, you will have seen these polygon assets on there, and they're super useful again as like kind of a baseline for experimenting with. But yeah, we can go in, say, a pixel art direction. For this one, I was really thinking about LucasArts point-and-click games from the mid-90s, like the kind of palettes they used, this like really super warm, inviting lighting, and also like the shapes within these polygon packs. Obviously, within the assets themselves, they're all like faceted and sharp-looking, but yeah, just using the silhouettes, like softening everything and just like turning it into these shapes, it kind of reminds me of like Day of the Tentacle, if anybody's old enough to remember those games. Yeah, another example. Again, just thinking about the palette, thinking of how, limited they were, but how much they got out of those limited numbers of colors they had back in the day, and the limited resolution. And this is the same scenes, that same town scene, but this time inspired by something like, I don't know, Beavis and Butthead, like the kind of flat, very little lighting within the scenes. This whole asset pack is kind of interesting because it's a single material for the whole, I think it's a single material. I'm pretty sure it's a single material for the entire scene. So again, you get like flexibility really quickly because it's all just color swatches for all of this. So I turned off the directional light and put the diffuse texture into the emissive as well. So I just get kind of full lit for the entire scene. And then added a bit of screen space occlusion. There's a tiny like drop shadow that, like, rather than using a directional light for the entire scene, I just did a spotlight that has a radius of like 100 units or something like that, just to get a little bit of top-down lighting on some of the stuff that's in the foreground. Yeah, and we can see the same scene at different times of day. Like, once you have like a robust setup, it's really quick then to do these, variations on different times of day, different weather, different mood, whatever. And again, yeah, same thing, but some sort of 8-bit horror treatment. I guess this is like EGA, CGA type palette. I don't know how many colors you get for that. 16 or something. Yeah. And to talk a little bit more about the kind of flexibility of working this way, as I say before, once you start to build, it's kind of like working in Photoshop and having a bunch of brushes that you can go to, or what have you, custom shapes and things like that. Once you have like a bunch of different assets that you can reuse and a bunch of shaders and post-processing resources and things like that, then it's really quick, as I keep reiterating, it's really quick to then create something new. So this was inspired by a Japanese artist named Hiroshi Yoshida from like late 19th, early 20th century. Very influential on a lot of manga and comic art that came afterwards. But most of the assets, pretty much all of the assets in the scene, came from something I'd already made, So I'd already made the scene on the right, and I was like, oh, I really want to do something in the style of Hiroshi Yoshida. And so, yeah, with a little bit of change to like the value range, slight changes to the base material, and then a different post-processing setup with line work and so on top of it, you can make it feel pretty different pretty quickly. The gate, again, was something I just took from Sketchfab. It's like a photogrammetry scan. And I found that, what was I going to say? Yeah, I found that if you have like a pretty solid setup in terms of the rendering and the post-processing, then more often than not, you can just drop a new asset into that scene, regardless of where it's come from. Maybe you might have to do like a little bit of texture work, like knock back some of the contrast of the detail to make it fit. But generally, I've found that things just sit within the scene pretty well, regardless of whether you've like made them or bought them or found them on some random website. And I guess I should say at this point, a lot of this work isn't meant to be finished, obviously, shipping content for games. This is all about exploration and finding the look. And so doing it in a way that's as quick and as flexible as possible is the most important thing, right? You don't want to be I don't want to spend a day or 2 days trying to model a Japanese style gate. So yeah, I definitely have this kind of scrappy ethos when it comes to working. So to talk a bit about inspiration and motivation, I'm going to speak more specifically about one scene that I created. And the reason I've chosen this particular picture is a few years ago I was looking at a lot of anime backgrounds, Studio Ghibli and various different films. And this isn't from a Studio Ghibli film. It's from a movie called Princess Arete, which isn't a great film from a story perspective, but the backgrounds are amazing and like super painterly, like more loose, and you can kind of see the brushwork a lot more. And this is like one of the most mundane shots in the entire movie. It's just a stone wall. But even within that, I was taken by how much local color variety there was, a sense of like different edges that when you're painting, you're thinking a lot about different qualities of edges, hard edges, soft edges, how you create different dynamics between surfaces. And I started to wonder, rather than, the classic thing to do to recreate a look like that to be used in a game would be to, maybe sculpt it or paint it, do like a painterly texture. And I started wondering, going down this kind of stylized aesthetic route, could I do all of this or most of it within the shader and the post-processing versus sitting there and laboriously creating all of these all of these assets from scratch, like sculpting lots of stones or, painting them in Photoshop, which is totally cool as well. Like, it's super fun to do, but I thought there was probably a quicker way to achieve similar results, or maybe better, more dynamic results. So here is the scene that I created inspired by those kinds of paintings. And there should be some very peaceful music right now, so imagine some in your own head. So I'm gonna talk about this scene specifically, and it is from a few years ago, so there are things that I've done since then that looking back, would probably do different within this scene now. But I really want to talk about the importance of traditional artistic principles within the process of making this scene. It goes on for a bit, so we can skip ahead. So it just so happened that around the time that I was wanting to work within this aesthetic, I got the opportunity to work on like the very early blue sky stages of a game, a live service game. And they were looking for an art style that, like, the game had like quite a big map, and as it's a live service game, they wanted to have maximum flexibility, but they didn't want to sacrifice the kind of artistic quality along with that flexibility. So just to talk about those design and art requirements that the project had. So like I say, it required maximum flexibility of the game's world. At the same time, the environment would need to be to feel well crafted and easy to iterate upon without sacrificing artistic quality. It needed to look painterly, but without relying on hand-painted textures or baked lighting. Also needed to scale across different spec platforms. And the bottom value was my own, but this is kind of something I think about a lot, which is to make the art creation process feel as expressive as possible. And when I say expressive, I guess I mean I want there to be as few barriers between me having an idea and being able to actually attain that thing within the engine. And oftentimes I find, tech and tools and things like that, when it works, it's great, but sometimes the process of doing and having to redo things can kind of make you lose that initial spark of inspiration, whatever it was. So I was looking for a workflow that was as kind of quick and what you see is what you get as possible. So this was the initial piece that I did as pitch work for them. And I basically started, as I will show in a minute, started using this customized cell shader, cell tune style cell shading that you might see in like Wind Waker or any number of games. Like taking that same principle of having a custom light fall off gradient. So I started thinking about, like, rather than having, say, a two-tone split between light and dark, as you might with a traditional cell-shaded character, you might have like 2 or 3 values. What if you had, say, 5 values on that? But then rather than having super hard contrast, sharp edges between all of those bands, you actually blend and soften those so they feel more painterly. So that's where this kind of initial exploration came from. And so, I just took a few assets, and, the characters were things that I made previously to pitch them on this idea, and they were happy with it, so we went in that direction. Unfortunately, I can't show more from that actual project, but I took that same principle and then applied it to a scene of my own. So to talk about different ways of achieving a sort of stylized look, and this goes back to what I was saying before. We've got 3 examples here. We've got a bit from the scene I created on the left, and then we've got a kind of sculpted, ZBrush rock in the middle, and then a hand-painted one on the right. And I think they're all like totally valid methods of creation, but obviously the middle one and the right-hand side one, they take a lot longer than the way that I've been creating stuff. And also, when it comes to particularly the hand-painted stuff, I mean, it looks fantastic. Like that rock on the right-hand side is really a beautiful piece of work, but it really only works its best in specific lighting conditions. So it will look fantastic from specific angles and when the lighting is, relatively neutral. But then when you want to shift things around in terms of the lighting or the camera, it might not hold up as well. So another factor that I was really thinking about was like, if we do all of the painterliness at the shader level rather than authoring it through a texture or a sculpt, in theory, we should then have maximum flexibility in terms of being able to change lighting and all sorts of other parameters, and everything will still stay kind of one-to-one as it should. Here are some examples of materials I created for the scene, just matte caps of different surfaces. So I'm going to point. So these are the ones I created, and on the right-hand side, we have just a kind of standard PBR surface shader, just to show the different ways that, say, move again, how the light falls off differently. You see it's kind of doing it in bands and it's kind of broken up versus obviously your typical like Lambert-based shader falls off in a very uniform gradient from light to dark. So yeah, so one of the things I wanted to highlight at this point was this idea of working in this way with custom shaders and customized post-processing stack means that, and this kind of goes back to the example that I showed previously, anything you then put into the scene, assets can come from different sources, and with just a little bit of work, you can kind of make everything feel super cohesive. So in the case of this scene, these rocks, like pretty much all of the rocks, this is all photogrammetry stuff that I just did a poly reduce on. And I think it still feels suitably painterly, next to everything else, next to the trees or the foliage or anything else. So kind of, again, saves a lot of time working that way. Yeah, to talk about cell shading a little bit without going into too much detail. So kind of standard Lambert diffuse type shader, it's just a smooth gradient from light to dark, depending on where the light is in the scene. And then your sort of classic two-tone cell shader just splits it somewhere in the middle, so you have a light side and a dark side. And then you might do something like you put like 2 or 3 cuts in, so you get, a number of different values along that range. But like I say, and this is kind of a classic example of that from Breath of the Wild. But my idea was to think about, well, these bandings, they don't have to be all of the same dimensions, and the actual edges between them can be softer or harder. And so with that in mind, I use this asset called FlatKit. I was going to say as well, I'm not a programmer, so a lot of the stuff I do is I find assets, I buy them, or I find them on different places, random GitHub repos, and then adapt them to whatever it is that I need. So I sort of used a classic cell shader as the basis, but then added a bunch of extra features, or used these extra features that exist within this particular within this particular shader. So, you know, a lit and shaded color, an extra color that could go kind of in between the two of them, so you can kind of get, you know, some hue and saturation variation within that light to dark gradient. What else? Yeah, specular color and width. Colorizable cast shadows, again, which I think really helps with that painterly feel, is being able to specify a color versus, you know, typically dynamic shadows are just a multiply of whatever's, you know, whatever color is on that particular object. Height gradient, which is really nice and exists within the shader for like blending things. There are different ways you can do this. You can do it like within the material. You could do it as a separate material pass that you add that blends with the actual terrain within the world, things like that. Yeah, and an input for an albedo and a normal map. So yeah, with all of those graphical features in mind, I then wanted to use traditional art principles, as I was saying before, to then let that guide the process of creating assets to work within this scene. So I chose kind of three key traditional principles from painting, which are limited values, varying edge quality, and analogous colors. So limited values, you know, when you're painting in real life, even if you end up blending and having more gradations within an actual finished work, oftentimes when you're blocking in a painting, you're really only using a handful of values. And I wanted to try and do something similar within these gradients that I was creating to go within the custom cell shaders. So you can see, like these pots, they just have these kind of 4 values, and they're broken up with different degrees of soft and hardness between the bands, but you can kind of see the fall off there, which is, you know, pretty similar to how it works within this example. Yeah, and again, when you paint with limited values, you also tend to paint within one of the 3 keys. So it's either, you know, high, medium, or low key, depending on what kind of painting you want to make. You can see with, yeah, I mean, this example is still pretty broad in terms of its range of values, but it doesn't really go anywhere quite near the darkest dark or the lightest light. And yeah, I kind of wanted to do something similar. You can see the examples here, these materials here. Obviously, this is like a very simple, standard PBR type material with no like bounce or anything like that. So it's kind of, you know, light to dark, 1 to 0. But then, yeah, by comparison, the ones that I created, you know, the darkest value is probably like, I don't know, a 6 or 7, and the lightest value is probably like a 2 or something like that. So again, like trying to compress that value range to make things feel more cohesive. And in theory, when you do that, it sort of makes things sit together really nicely for the most part, so that the things that you want the viewer, the player, to look at, they get your attention first of all. So hopefully that's, you know, the character, and then maybe your eye goes up around to this symbol and things like that. Yeah. So varying edge quality. This is something you see a lot of in traditional painting, using different strengths of edges to either draw attention to something or let things fade into the background. And the edge quality within traditional painting typically happens in 3 ways. So you've got a change in object, you know, the sort of the edge of one object in front of something else, or a change in plane, so the form changing, so going from, say, like the top of an object to the side of an object. So you describe that in a form of, you know, some kind of edge, or a change in color. You've got like 2 colors coming up against each other. So some of those things are hard to do in a 3D scene. You can't necessarily have full control over how edges bleed into each other, you know, one object in front of another. but I still wanted to try and capture some of that same feel within the shaders, within the material. So we've got an example here. As I was saying before, you've got the kind of classic light to dark gradient on the left-hand side here, just like straight light to dark. Then we've got in the middle 4 values, but pretty sharp in terms of the way that they fall off into each other. And then we have softer or like a greater variety of value changes within the gradient. And also these 2 textures which are adding more breakup. So the normal map is kind of doing something similar to scumbling, if you know, in like traditional painting, when you kind of take a dry brush and like move paint from one area into another to give it that kind of scratchy feeling. So that was kind of what I was trying to get with the use of a normal map within the shader. And as I say, like I tried not to author too many individual textures or, you know, sculpt things from scratch, but I did create this one tiling stone texture, and I basically just took a bunch of low poly stones, made like a tiling area of texture, and my plan was then to take that into ZBrush and do the kind of classic thing of like sitting there and like sculpting details and sculpting different kinds of edges within ZBrush, which is a super fun way to work, but probably would have taken me a number of hours. And rather than doing that, I just took that idea of scumbling and of like taking paint from one area of an object or one area of a painting and kind of having it splat over into another one. And I took that normal map into Photoshop and just used a smudge brush with scatter on. So it's that same principle of kind of bits of paint from different areas of the canvas kind of blending with each other in this kind of graphical way. And yeah, so I did that, and you know, and it took sort of, I don't know, 10 minutes versus the 4 hours it would have taken me to sculpt them all in ZBrush. But I think it fits better with the aesthetic. It's maybe kind of hard to see at this detail, at this range, but you can kind of see these areas where it's getting broken up, and it has that feeling, I think, of that example I showed at the start of that, you know, painted animation background. Yeah, and lastly, in terms of traditional art principles that I wanted to use within this process is analogous colors. And, you know, analogous colors, generally you choose 3 colors that all sit next to each other on the color wheel. And you tend to have like one of those be the dominant color, and it tends to be a primary color, and then you have like a secondary color and also maybe an accent to round it out. But using analogous colors gives everything this sort of vibrancy that's hard to achieve sometimes when, like within say a real-time scene, if you have like a, you know, a lighting gradient that's just like simply going from light to dark, you can't necessarily get those kind of local color pops that you would get if you were painting something traditionally or as a concept. To show the example as, you know, monochrome, like if you didn't have the local color variations, then immediately the scene looks way less inviting and interesting. So yeah, just to go back to that original example that inspired the scene, on the left we've got like the original version, and on the right I just cranked up the saturation so you can see the actual variety that there is to the hues, which is kind of hard to tell when you're looking at it at low saturation. But yeah, you know, you've got yellows, oranges, reds, probably even going into kind of purple in some areas. So there is like a lot going on in terms of vibrancy. And I really wanted to try and get that into this creation process. And so what I did is I used those different colors that I mentioned that exist within this shader. You have, you know, like a lit color, a shadow color, a sort of mid color, and, you know, specular color, all these things. Like I tried to shift the hue and the saturation for each one of them so that it felt more like I was making decisions as if I was painting. Because if you were painting the scene, you would be constantly making judgments and choices about which colors to use where, and like where to increase or change the hue or the saturation. And as a result, you can kind of see, you know, this is how it would be if we didn't have these extra colors on a material shader basis within these objects. It would just be this like straight light to dark. Whereas with these extra colors within that value range, you get, a nice journey from kind of warm to cool back to warm, or other way around, cool to warm back to cool. So here are just a few more examples from the scene, the finished scene. Oh yeah, so, the post-processing aspect of this particular scene is very simple. There's not a lot going on. A lot of the scenes that I showed earlier on, the majority of the work is done in post-processing. But for this one, it was essentially, a base render, then some tone mapping to increase the contrast and the saturation a bit, screen space occlusion, and a small amount of depth of field and chromatic aberration, and then vignette again to kind of focus attention in the center of the image and bring up the contrast a bit more. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the talk. Just to reiterate what I was saying at the start, I hope if you're coming from more of a 2D or a 3D artist background and you're curious about experimenting with different aesthetics for games, it can seem kind of intimidating to crack open an entirely new piece of software, but once you get a handle on how different aspects work, like materials or lighting or post-processing, and you start to build up a library of different resources that you can use and reuse, then you start to see the connections between, oh, I did this kind of aesthetic with this set of assets. I wonder if I could do this thing over here as well. And normally you can, so I hope people will consider using these kinds of real-time tools within the concepting process more. And for tech artists and programmers, I hope that maybe there's an interest to look at, particularly when working within stylized games, to look at traditional media and traditional art techniques. Because like I say, even though technology is constantly advancing, we still look back at all of these techniques and use them all the time. So using them within the process of creating shaders and things like that, I think is super useful and gives you a different perspective rather than just a purely technological one. Thanks very much for listening. And if anybody has any questions, either feel free to ask them now, or if you wanted to talk afterwards, I'll be hanging around. So if you have anything I can help with, then give me a shout. Anybody?
Hello, thanks for the talk. I had a question, because I'm a programmer, and when you're done finding out the style that fits what you want, and you hit what you see is really high cost on the machine, what would be your process then? Would you try to see what can be subtracted, or would you, if you feel like it's might not work because, for example, we're targeting mobile and there's no way it's going to work, then you go back to the drawing board?
Yeah, absolutely. There's kind of two different things. There's the projects that I do that are purely as explorations, and then the things that I do professionally. And the things that I do professionally, it's always with a kind of target platform, a target frame rate in mind. And there's certain things in here which are still kind of a no-go for mobile. Post-processing is kind of still that thing. VR, if that's still an ongoing concern, it's kind of similar as well. So there's definitely trade-offs to be made. But I would say there are other ways, I think, to limit the cost performance-wise. You can, like I was saying, the scene, the polygon town scene, you can get that working with just a single material sort of thing. So that maybe you can make real savings in that respect. You're not having to render a load of unique textures or materials. You can just do it with a single map maybe, and the gains there might be enough that you can kind of offset some of the other stuff that's happening in the post-processing section.
Yeah, so basically another possibility would be can it be worked around with the rest of development?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
keep it as is, but see if it can be discussed.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Cheers.
Hi.
Hi there.
Yeah, just wanted to know when you work for clients, if you bring your own tools, your own building blocks, or if you have to work in the constraints of using what's already present and mastered by the team that you're working with.
Yeah, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but typically I'm generally working right at the start of a project, so oftentimes they don't have a lot of resources already. Like even if they've chosen an engine, even if they've started to, block out levels, the art process is probably still in the 2D phase at that point. So oftentimes I will bring my own stuff, or I will go, like I say, go on the marketplace or the asset store, get something that's like 80% close to what they're doing from a thematic point of view or an IP point of view, and then say, look, we're gonna author bespoke assets for all of this, but let's just look at it with something that's close to it and see if the overall effect is what we want before we start to invest hundreds, thousands of hours in like creating all these assets from scratch. So yeah, I tend to if they've got more stuff, like if they already have assets or if they already have blocked out a bunch of geometry, I will take whatever they have and I will use that in my scene. But oftentimes it's like the stuff doesn't exist yet, so I'll tend to just reuse stuff that I've already made or go and find stuff that's close enough.
And for the technical parts, technical tools and techniques, do you have to sometimes limit to what they know how to do, or?
Yeah, I mean, most people have been quite flexible because I've typically worked, again, like I say, like right at the start of the process, so not many stakes have been put in the ground in terms of like it's got to be this particular kind of shader or this is the workflow, this is the pipeline. It's often, the work that I do is often helping to work out what that should be even. There have been cases where I've joined a bit later on in a project where they've already decided we want to work in this aesthetic and this is the way that we've chosen to do it. And in that case, obviously, I'll use their pre-existing resources, their shaders, whatever kind of setup they're using. But yeah, oftentimes it's part of that exploration process to work out, is this aesthetic feasible and what's the best way to do it?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Speaking about technique, I didn't get it very well. What are the software you usually use for these experimentations?
I mean, I use both Unity and Unreal. I'd say I've spent more time in Unity so far. But a lot of the client work I've been doing in the last few years has tended more to be in Unreal. So either of those two engines, and then, kind of modeling, doesn't really matter, Blender or whatever. And Photoshop, for if I have to do any textures, tends to just be in Photoshop. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I use a lot of extra assets within, both Unity and Unreal. Like I say, I use visual scripting tools. So if there's a component of what I'm doing for them that's like more like a look and feel gameplay demo, like even if it's as simple as like we want to put a character in there to just run around to get a feel for how things are, then I'll just find a character controller or I'll use visual scripting to connect everything up. But yeah, typically just the two main engines. I'd really like to have a play around in Godot. I haven't had the time to do so yet, but feel like I might be migrating over there at some point. But yeah, just that and the standard tools really for asset creation. Yeah.
And I don't really know Unreal, but you neither Godot, but you find a path between these three engines, or do you have to learn almost from scratch?
I mean, there's both, like Unity and Unreal do things in different ways. Like I'd say that there are things that are a lot easier to achieve in Unity versus Unreal when it comes to stylization at a kind of rendering level. is my non-technical, like as a user, you know, my understanding of it. But I think you can still get to a lot of the same results within Unreal. You just have to kind of jump through the hoops in a kind of different order. So yeah, there is some amount of relearning, but then a lot of the principles are the same, and a lot of like the inputs that you're using in terms of, you know, textures and shader nodes and things like that, they're kind of the same between what you would get in shader graph versus what you get in the material editor in Unreal. So there are differences, but like there's a universal kind of language that goes between the two engines, I think, as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for the impressive talk. I was wondering if you ever feel the need to dig into like the rendering pipeline and graphics programming side of things, or do you manage to just get by manipulating like base passes and like?
Yeah, I think that would be a step too far for me. Like as much as I kind of have an understanding of the various parameters that go into making it, you know, a specific shader. Like, I'm not a programmer, and I think it'd be too much of I'd have to like go back to school basically to do that. And that's the thing I was going to say, was that I think you can get a lot of variety purely as kind of an end user, you know, because the wealth of different assets that are available for both engines, and like different different ways of achieving stylized looks with shader packages and post-processing and things like that. Like, yeah, I think it's, for me, for somebody who's like definitely a visual thinker and likes to just experiment and work out how to do things by playing around, like, I find this way of working is really good. And yeah, I'm limited to what I can do this way, yeah. Thanks. All good. All right, well, thanks again for coming, and I really appreciate it. And yeah, if you have any questions, you want to come up and chat after, feel free to do so. Cheers.